Well, thank you all for coming out today. My name is Matt Steiger. I am the chairman, and I have the pleasure of serving as the chairman of the Young Americans for Freedom chapter here at UAH. At Young Americans for Freedom, we pride ourselves on being on the front lines of the conservative movement ever since our founding in 1960. Our chapter's mission is to educate the students of the University of Alabama in Huntsville on the principles and the values that made America and continue to make America the greatest nation that has ever been. This event would not be possible without Pat Coyle and Young America's Foundation. YAF has been with us every step of the way to ensure that this event was a great success. I would also like to extend a great thank you to my executive officers and the committee that put so many hours of hard work and dedication into this event to make it successful. Just a few housekeeping items. Number 1, please silence your cell phones. Number 2, refrain from conversation during lecture and Q&A, but just be respectful. Number 3, no signs, noisemakers, or objects that may disrupt the experience of others. Okay. Before the writing of his most recent literary masterpiece, our speaker for tonight, Michael Knowles, has done everything from political campaign consulting to theater, television, and cinema acting, including starring in the feature-length film Hollyweird. Michael Knowles is the best known for the writing of his most recent book, The Reasons to Vote for Democrats, A Comprehensive Guide, which has been hailed by President Trump as a great book for your reading enjoyment, and Ben Shapiro as thorough. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this book, it is 266 pages of entirely chapter numbers, chapter names, and page numbers. Okay, very thorough. Michael Knowles is a familiar face to some of us. At this past summer's National Conservative Student Conference, which 7 of our members attended, Michael Knowles rebutted Ambassador Nikki Haley's speech about owning the libs that she gave at the Turning Point Conference about a week before. Following the lecture, Michael answered a question regarding the time that it took to write this book. He said, and I quote, "It didn't take me very long to write. It took me very long to research. I was researching this book my whole life." Please join me in welcoming the man who will never back down from saying what he believes, Michael Knowles.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank YAF for hosting all of this, and I want to thank the University of Alabama in Huntsville, of course, and everybody for coming out tonight. This is the 4th stop on the Covfefe on Campus tour, and I'm so pleased you could be here for this. If you are wondering what is the definition of Covfefe, I'm afraid that I cannot help you. I can't define it for you. Covfefe is a lot like pornography, in that you can't quite define it, but you know it when you see it. If I had to describe Covfefe, I would describe it as the sort of devil-may-care attitude that conservatives have right now, an exuberance on the right, a reinvigoration about the simple joys of being right. And I really have to thank you all for having me here, because truly I needed a break from my studio. I had to get out of the news cycle. I had to get out of the Daily Wire. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what President Trump meant when he warned us all in 2015 that we could get sick and tired of winning. I am almost sick and tired of winning, but almost is the operative word here. Because I thought I had it. I thought I could handle all of it. I could handle the booming economy. I could handle record low joblessness. I could handle relative peace abroad. But then 2 weeks ago, a United States Senator from the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, she came out with a DNA test to prove that indeed she is 1,024th Native American, as though this vindicated and validated her decades of pretending to be an Indian for professional advantage. All of this on the heels of Kanye West, perhaps the most famous pop musician of our time, sitting in the Oval Office, wearing a Make America Great Again hat, making fun of liberals, assailing the welfare state as destroying, in particular, the black family. All of this. By the way, he now has a new clothing line called Blexit. Unbelievable. All of this on the heels of confirming Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court after, yeah, that's worth a round of applause, absolutely. Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Justice Brett Kavanaugh on the court now after unprecedented obstruction. They thought they had him. They dug back 35, 36 years. They found some woman who could tell a few different stories about this and that. It was no corroboration, but that's okay. They're going to find another woman with Michael Avenatti, and they thought they had him, but they didn't have him. And we got him onto the court, and this has now moved the direction of the Supreme Court. It has swung the balance in the direction of originalism, in the direction of textualism, in the direction of interpreting the Constitution to mean what it plainly says on paper. I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling really good. It's a lot to handle. By the way, on top of all of that, on top of the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh, which the Democrats were certain was going to help them in the midterm elections, even if they failed to stop his nomination, they were certain this would buoy them in the midterms, totally swung back, a total reversal. There was a Kavanaugh effect that put momentum back on all of the swing state Republicans. That's a lot to handle. Almost too much. Almost too much winning. And this isn't new in 2018 or 2017. This goes back to November 8th, 2016, when we elected President Trump. But it actually goes back much further than that. Beginning in 2010, the conservatives overtook the House. In 2014, we took the Senate. In the meantime, we won virtually every state house and governorship in the country. Now we've taken hold of the Supreme Court. All of this because President Barack Obama's policies were so unpopular in this country. He made his party so unpopular, so politically unviable. And to all of that, I must say, thanks, Obama. I must say it, and I mean it. I earnestly mean thanks, Obama. He did it. He made them so unpopular. He made his leftism so brazen. He proved the thesis of my #1 best-selling political tome, which we're here to discuss tonight, Reasons to Vote for Democrats, A Comprehensive Guide. I could not have done it without him. If well, you know, I did have the Clintons, and I had Teddy Kennedy and LBJ and Jimmy Carter and Nancy Pelosi. I probably could have done it without him, honestly. But he really helped because he was so brazen about everything. And there was even one moment, you know, on the campaign, President Barack Obama said, he forgot about all of the people of this country, and he said that they are all bitter clingers, clinging to their guns and religion. This was an early version of the deplorable and irredeemable Americans, a test run for a line that didn't work well for Hillary in 2016. He also said that he wanted to fundamentally transform the country, which is evidence that he probably didn't like the country very much. As a general rule, you do not want to fundamentally transform things that you like. When I got married recently in June, and I did not look my wife in the eye on my wedding day, sweet little Elise, and I said, "Oh, honey, I love you so much. I can't wait to spend my whole life fundamentally transforming you. Oh, baby, I want you to be totally unrecognizable by the time I'm through. That's how much I love you." Of course not. Of course not. So Barack Obama provided a lot of fodder for my #1 best-selling book. And I should point out at this point, some people insist that I'm not really an author. Because, you know, my book, it didn't have a lot of words in it. It had a cover, table of contents, an extensive bibliography, but not a whole lot of words. And I understand this criticism. I will even accept it. But I am certainly more of an author than Elizabeth Warren is an Indian. So if Elizabeth Warren is an Indian, then I most certainly am a #1 best-selling author. I should point out, too, the book is not original. There have been many blank books in American history. There was The Wit and Wisdom of the German People. There is Everything Men Know About Women. That came out about 25 years ago. Sex After 50 is another title. So mine was in a long string. And actually, the earliest version of a blank book in American history dates back to the 1880 presidential election, when the Republican ticket of James Garfield and Chester Arthur published a book about their political opponent titled A Record of the Statesmanship and Political Achievements of General Winfield Scott Hancock, Regular Democratic Nominee for President. 5 blank pages. Because paper was more expensive then. So I could use 250 blank pages. They could only do 5. And this is a true story. When I published my book, I received a phone call from the Washington Post. And the reporter, a very nice guy, he called me and he said, "Michael, I've got a left-winger calling me, accusing you of plagiarism." I said, "Excuse me?" He apparently had done a blank book on the lines of Why I Respect Donald Trump or something like that. And his book sold like 2 copies, and my book sold 200,000 copies, and he was very envious, and so he accused me of plagiarism, to which I responded that I stole nothing. I think it was probably lost on him. He's a little bit of a groaner, that's fine. So it is an interesting question, though. Why the left-wing version didn't sell at all, and the right-wing version sold 200,000 copies. I think a large part of it has to do with the humorlessness of the left at the moment. Because I am older than most people in this room, so I can attest in my great age and wisdom. There was a time when Jimmy Kimmel would tell jokes. So Jimmy Kimmel, he was a comedian, and he had something that's called a late-night comedy program, where Jimmy Kimmel, he would walk out, and he would tell some jokes in his monologue, and then the audience would laugh at the jokes. And now, of course, none of that happens. Now Jimmy Kimmel comes out, and he cries. He cries almost every night. He weeps and he cries. And then the audience doesn't laugh. They clap. And this is what is considered an alternative to comedy. The right, on the other hand, we're having a grand old time. We're having a far, far better time than our friends on the left who are shrieking and whining and screaming, "No!" And then hopefully they'll be doing that again on November 6th. We'll have to wait and see. So the right had a lot of fun with the blank book. There were thousands of reviews on Amazon, and the thing that stood out about these reviews is that they were so witty, they were so learned, they were so literary. You'd have 10-paragraph long reviews. Just one example, a reviewer wrote, quote, "In this poetic work, I have found what my heart has felt, but my words could never express." He captures the very soul of the Democratic Party with a profundity of insight I never would have thought to find in a fellow cisgendered white male. Very honored by that one. Another review written by Roger Kimball in the Weekly Standard compared my work to the ambitions of Gustave Flaubert, which of course was going through my mind while I was assembling the tome. So I became the John Cage of political philosophy. And I point this out purely for instructive purposes. I made a lot of money on that blank book. I made a lot of money on nothing. And this brings us to our question tonight, because I assume that nobody in this room had the winning Mega Millions ticket a couple weeks ago. This makes it even more urgent for us, because now everybody is $2 poorer than they were before, and now we need to figure out a way to write nothing and sell 100,000 copies. I think I have the answer. I think I have a one-word answer. The way to write nothing and sell 100,000 copies is capitalism. Oh, capitalism. Primarily, the way to write nothing and sell 100,000 copies is the grace of God, because manna has to fall from somewhere. That's certainly the case. But coincidentally, capitalism, our free market capitalist economic system, does have its roots in the moral and religious foundations of our very own civilization. And we'll get to that in just a second. So as a practical economic matter, the way to write nothing and sell 100,000 copies is capitalism. And capitalism gets a very bad rap these days. It's under assault from the left. It's under assault from some quarters of the right. Right now in the country, there are over 40 candidates running with the official backing of the Democratic Socialists of America, the darling of the Democrat Party now. Have you heard of her, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? My friend Steve Hayward refers to her as Alexandria Occasional Cortex. She is the darling of the party. She's helping to raise money for a lot of candidates. And coincidentally, actually, I grew up in the town right next to where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez grew up. I know that now she pretends to be Jenny from the block, but she's not. She is from a very wealthy suburb. She grew up in total privilege, actually in the richer town than I grew up in Westchester. All of that thanks to capitalism. However, Alexandria may be the voice of her generation when it comes to socialism, and I'm sorry to say that. According to Gallup polling, the majority of American millennials identify as socialist. They have a favorable view of socialism. They don't have a favorable view of capitalism. That's the bad news. The good news is that only 32% of millennials can define what socialism actually is. So fortunately, it seems that we have a crisis not of capitalism or of economics, but a crisis of education. This is borne out by a lot of other surveys, too. One survey by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation shows that 1/3 of American millennials believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. The crisis of education is acute and terrifying. So what we have to do here is clear up the confusion. And actually, the blank book is a perfect way to do that, because the blank book, in its form and content, extols the many virtues and wonders of capitalism. Maybe not in the content, well, in the lack of content. The book extols the many virtues, and certainly in the form of it. The way that this book was produced is miraculous. It is nothing short of miraculous how this blank book came together. Obviously, the idea came to me all at once. It struck me. I had been researching it my whole life, but it all came to me at once, and then I wrote it in just about the same amount of time. It all came together, but I had to write a bibliography. I had to cite my sources, of which there are many. And so in the old days, even 30 years ago, this would have required me to go to at least one library, presumably many libraries. I would have had to open all of these books, search for all of the books, Rules for Radicals, for instance, by Saul Alinsky, biographies of Jimmy Carter, who knows. But instead, I didn't have to do that at all. Because of the magic of modern technology, I was able to do it on the internet in 15 minutes. Just sit there, I even formatted it properly, made sure the book was really scholarly. Now consider all of the forces and all of the tools that had to come together for me just to put together that bibliography. Obviously, I needed an internet connection, which means I needed Al Gore to invent well, maybe not. I don't know if I actually needed that. I needed a lot of people, though, to come together to connect billions of people around the globe on the freest, least centralized, least controlled, most open platform in human history. Consider all the many millions of men who were required to code those web pages, build the pages, install the internet lines, install the electric lines, all over, create those data connections. That is just for the internet connection. That says nothing of the manufacturers in China who built the computer on which I could access the internet, on which I could write the bibliography for my completely blank book. And that doesn't say all of it. Consider all of the designers and engineers in California who had to send the designs over to all the guys in China who could manufacture the computer on which I could get on the internet, on which I could write the bibliography to my book about nothing and sell 100,000 copies. And even that doesn't tell the whole story. Consider all of the miners in Africa and places on the Asian continent who had to dig up the raw materials, ship them over to China, where they could be manufactured into the computer that could be designed by the people in California, that could allow me to access the internet, on which I could write the bibliography to a book about absolutely nothing. All of those forces just to write the bibliography. Pretty impressive. Why did all of those millions of men do all of those tasks? Is it because they believed in my thesis? I hope so. I hope they do now that they've read the book. But I don't think that's why. I don't think they had any idea about my thesis. I think that all of those guys, the miners and the engineers and the manufacturers, did it because it was in their self-interest. They had their own goals and their own ends to pursue, and the way that they could pursue those goals and ends was to develop an expertise and a specialty that I needed to pursue my goals and ends, and they voluntarily used that expertise with millions of other people around the world, and we were able to create a completely blank book. There was no use of force or coercion here, and by the way, in the countries with the freest economics and the freest markets, such as our own, the coercion was virtually non-existent. Where the markets are freer, the options to pursue one's own self-interest are far, far greater. All of that, obviously, just for the bibliography. At no point did I ever sit down and have a meeting with the manufacturer or the factory worker or the designer. We didn't sit down and collude. Didn't collude with the Russians. I didn't have to collude with anybody, because we were all able to do this in open markets, and this arrived at a price which took all of that information for the shipping and the distribution and the production and the digging and all of that. It put all of that into a price. So we've got the bibliography, we've got the manuscript, I finished my manuscript, and I upload it to a print-on-demand platform called CreateSpace. Now, print-on-demand has been around for a long time, and in the old days, this was called a vanity publisher. When an author couldn't get his book published, and I assure you, in the modern publishing industry, I never could have had my magnum opus published if I went through a traditional publisher. In the old days, what people would do is they would pay the publisher to print the books themselves, and then they would worry about selling it. Today, that's not so necessary, because this print-on-demand company was purchased by Amazon.com, one of the biggest markets in the world, in 2005. And when Amazon went in there, they knew that people have a lot to say. These days, people have a whole lot to say. That's what Facebook makes its money on. That's what Twitter does. That's what YouTube does. Everybody has an opinion about something. So Amazon saw a way to make money. They went in there, they bought the print-on-demand company. And further, they refused to charge authors to print their own books. They realized that they could make more money by charging the customer of those books. So now I am able to take a book that even 2 hours earlier I hadn't written, upload it to the largest marketplace in the entire world, and on which over half of the world's books are sold, have it all up there at absolutely no cost to me. The cost is passed on down to the customer, and further, the book distributor in real time is monitoring sales, where sales are going, what the optimal price point is to sell the most blank books, and it will adjust the price, taking that cost onto itself to bring the most value to the customer, to the author, and to the profitability of the company itself. That is a miracle. That is all a miracle. I bet you didn't realize how much went into publishing absolutely nothing. So to call it a miracle, I think is instructive to millennials who, unfortunately, broadly speaking, remain wholly ignorant to the wonders of capitalism. The great 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton wrote, "We are perishing for want of wonder, not for want of wonders." There are incredible wonders all around, but we're losing our imagination, and American millennials are reverting to a stale, dead, awful ideology of economic totalitarianism, of socialism. This is the crisis of education. Ronald Reagan put it very well. He said that freedom doesn't get passed from generation to generation in the bloodstream. We're only ever one generation away from extinguishing liberty in our world. This increasing number of Americans pulled towards socialism, I think, speaks to a natural human impulse. I won't even call it socialism. We'll call it bluntly economic totalitarianism. And I think this is the natural state of man, the natural impulse, because men like to play God. We think that we can construct a better price than millions of people freely exchanging their goods and services and specialties in a market. We think we know better. I know better than the market. I can play God. I can construct this. And historically, things go very wrong when this happens. One need only look at the socialist hell of Venezuela, or at the Soviet Union, or at North Korea, or at China, absent some of its capitalist reforms, to see how horribly this fails. There's a little story a lot of people don't know. During the 1930s in the United States, during the height of economic totalitarianism, our president would set the price of gold by himself, just by fiat. He would wake up in the morning, this is not a joke, an economic advisor to the president admitted this. They would sometimes set the price of gold based on a lucky number in FDR's mind. He said, that 21, that seems like a lucky number, raise it 21 cents. The markets did not think that this was a very lucky number, and this prolonged the misery of economic malaise. I'm speaking in moral and religious terms here. I'm speaking about miracles. I'm speaking in these terms because capitalism has a moral and religious foundation. It's the most moral economic system ever devised by man. And I think we need to speak in moral terms when we defend capitalism. Efficiency is not going to cut it. Efficiency is very boring. People don't care that you were able to squeeze a little bit more profit out of the widget company, that we're managing ourselves into a greater prosperity. The left speaks in moral terms about socialism, it speaks in moral terms about capitalism, and those are morally bankrupt ideologies. They're slavery. We should speak in moral terms about economic liberty because it's a wonderful thing, it's very prosperous, it's very good, and it flows naturally from the religious foundations of our civilization. The moral case for capitalism is very strong. Winston Churchill described socialism as the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Put bluntly, it is slavery. He went on and he wrote, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." And this is what they do. Socialist politicians and demagogues and activists exploit envy. That's always what they do. Margaret Thatcher explained this very well. She said, you know, under capitalism, the rich might have this much money and the poor might have this much money. And under socialism, the rich will have this much and the poor will have this much. At least the number is closer. They don't care that everybody gets poorer. They just want everybody to be poor together, which I certainly don't want, and I don't think anybody really believes is a path to the future. You know, what the socialists forget to mention is growth. It's not just a stagnant economy. The rich guy doesn't get rich by stealing from the poor guy. The fat guy doesn't stay fat by stealing from the skinny guy. There is growth. Since the 1970s, the lowest quintile's share of U.S. income as a share of the total economy has decreased slightly. That's absolutely true. But the real income of everybody has dramatically increased. You don't need economists to show you this. Just look around at the wonders of the modern world. Everybody in this room, in their pockets, has a magical device that does anything you want. You can make phone calls, you can check emails, you can watch Netflix, you can probably toast Pop-Tarts, I don't know. That'll be the new version of Apple. You can do whatever you want. And actually, we're so accustomed to this insane prosperity that while we're driving and on a phone call and checking our email and toasting our Pop-Tarts, and the little gadget freezes for 2 seconds, we yell at it. We say, you magical device, work even faster. What's wrong with you? I live in total prosperity, and we take all of that for granted. The Heritage Foundation pointed this out. The Heritage Foundation in 2011 wrote, quote, that the average or typical American living in poverty, quote, lives in an air-conditioned house or apartment and has cable TV, a car, multiple television sets, a DVD player, and a VCR. It was 2011. People I don't think have VCRs anymore. I don't know what they were doing with them even then, but still a pretty good life. It has, the joys and wonders and virtues of capitalism, by the way, have affected the poor in the greatest way. Nowhere is this more evident than in China. In China, from 1981 to 2008, exactly when China was instituting capitalist free market economic reforms, the percentage of the population living in extreme poverty, that's $1.25 a day or less, fell from 84% to 13%. In real human terms, that is 400 million people lifted out of crushing poverty in just 30 years because of the wonders and virtues of capitalism. What record does socialism boast on helping the poor that could ever compete with that? Not one at all. Socialism makes them poor, and capitalist reforms and free market reforms have lifted them out of that poverty. You know, today, it's very fashionable to speak of imaginary rights. We hear of the right to health care or the right to a college education. Very soon we will hear of the right to a Tesla. And all of these imaginary rights seem to ignore the actual rights to one's labor and the security of one's property that those imaginary rights infringe on. If somebody has some new imaginary right to cosmetic surgery, let's say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wins, she's the grand emperor of the United States, and now everybody has a magical right to cosmetic surgery. That right infringes on the surgeon's right to his own labor, and it certainly will infringe on my right to my own property, which in taxes pays for the surgeon's labor to pay for the surgery. We take our property rights for granted here. We take the security of our property for granted. This is not true in many other places around the world. And the security of private property rights disproportionately helps the poor. Without the security of private property, people living in extreme poverty or who want to be entrepreneurs do not have collateral with which they can access capital. And once they access capital, then they can invest it, they can risk it, they can try to better their lot in life. If they don't have the security of their own property, then they'll be forced into black market arrangements. They will have likely deprived themselves of the rights to justice under the law, and they will not be able to better their lot in life. A very, very bad idea. We remember Adam Smith as an economist. You know, he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is the book that everybody cites and not a soul has ever read in all of human history. We remember him as an economist, but what we don't remember is that he was a moral philosopher. And modern capitalism finds its roots in the church, specifically in the 16th century School of Salamanca. The School of Salamanca, which described the just price as the common market price. It explained that man has a natural right to donate or transfer things that he legally owns in any way that he wants. And this idea of natural rights on which our country is founded, the premise of our country, natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they derive from the natural law described by St. Thomas Aquinas. And while we're speaking of saints, I will leave you on this note, which is one of the great saints of history, one of the great defenders of civilization against communist barbarism. Pope St. John Paul II wrote in his 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, he put this economic question in the starkest terms. He said, quote, "The free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to needs." Absolutely right. He's couching what is an argument for the efficiency and the usefulness of free markets in its moral context, which is where we can all speak from. Economic liberty is essential to personal liberty. If you don't have the freedom to use your labor and to use your property, you don't have very much freedom at all. And economic liberty and personal liberty relate to all other sorts of liberty. And it relates to virtue as well, because virtue isn't virtue when virtue is coerced. You must be free to be virtuous. When I do the dishes because sweet little Elisa threatens me under threat of bodily harm or murder to do the household chores, I'm not performing the virtue of doing the household chores. I am simply saving my own life. Man must be free to be virtuous, and God made man free. The nation is founded on this premise. As more and more millennials identify as socialist, and as fewer and fewer seem able to define it, we should define it for them, and we should take the argument on the grounds of economic liberty. We should defend it rigorously. We should defend it morally. We should defend it philosophically. And we should defend it politically as the midterm elections approach. And if you don't know what I mean by this last point, I highly recommend that you read my book. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be doing a Q&A session, and before we get started, I'm just going to give you all some instructions, so don't move until I finish these. All right, so if you want to ask a question, please go to the right side over there with the stairwell, go up in front of the desk, come down, and stop at Anders right here. All right? For your questions, each person needs to have one question. It needs to be brief and no follow-ups unless Mr. Knowles would like you to. All right? And
I should point out, too, the Daily Wire has a rule, which is that if you disagree with me, you get to cut the line. I think this is a terrible rule. I think this is horrible incentives, speaking of economics, but that is the rule. So if you disagree with me, please feel free to cut the line.
all right, well, as you heard him, so we can get started now if you would like to head up and around. And please stop at Anders right here. Thank you.
This is kind of a funny sight from my vantage, because I just see people climbing over all the other people in these sort of tight seats.
Yep, I'm just going to hold it for you. All right.
hold for me? All right. Sorry, I got to pull my question real quick. So I'm going to start off my question with a quote from Ben Bernanke. He's the economist at Brookings Institute and was the 14th chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was nominated by George W. Bush. His quote starts off, "Our willingness to trade freely with the world is indeed an essential source of prosperity." And he continued to say that any effort to restrict trade is exactly the wrong thing to do. I'd like to ask, how can anyone call the Republican Party the party of facts over feelings when they reject their own experts?
In what way have we rejected our experts? You've just extolled the virtue of free trade. Where are we seeing free trade around the world? Are we seeing free trade around the world while China blatantly violates World Trade Organization treaties? Are we seeing free trade while China subsidizes illegally its steel and aluminum industries? Are we seeing free trade while China steals our intellectual property as a fact of doing business over there? I don't think that's free trade at all. Are we seeing free trade while China plants spyware in our technology that has infiltrated our corporate structures and our government? I don't think that's free trade at all. We all want free trade. The President of the United States said, we want free trade. We want to bring tariffs to zero if we can. But we're not going to allow ourselves to be abused by the rest of the world, by our enemies and our opponents, or by our allies or our friends, particularly our friends whose militaries we pay for, whose defense we pay for. We need it to be fair. If we're imagining some sort of free trade regime that has allegedly existed for the last decade, I think we're speaking in fictions. So I think it's absolutely right. I want to be able to trade freely all around the world so long as it doesn't pose a national security interest. But we've got to get our heads out of the sand and stop pretending that that's what we've got. And we've got to hold the leaders of other countries accountable, and that way we can all prosper.
So in light of her interview yesterday in which she said that she will decide on a 2020 presidential run after the midterms, what are your thoughts on Hillary Clinton potentially running again, and what would your feelings be?
Please, Hillary, I know you're watching. I know you're watching, Hillary. Hillary, my third cousin, once removed. That's a true story, by marriage. We don't talk about that at family reunions. Please, Hillary, run for re-election. By the way, she made a racially inappropriate joke during that very same thing. She said that all black people look alike. That was her before she even announced her 7,000th run for the presidency. Please do it. You know, being on the left means never having to say that you're sorry. Hillary, you go right ahead. You run against those deplorable, irredeemable, bitter, clinging, awful American people. I can't wait. We're going to win all 57 states that Barack Obama promised us.
So my question is about Kavanaugh. It's obvious that he lied under oath, and so I don't understand why it is good or moral or winning to support his confirmation. And to lay out the case that he lied under oath, there are several times that he lied under oath, but I think the easiest for me to explain is his recounting of Leland Kaiser's position on the alleged happenings.
Leland Kaiser,
right?
who said that she never met Brett Kavanaugh in her entire life, who Christine
Correct.
Ford said was at the party.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. So Brett Kavanaugh repeatedly said that she denied and refuted the
Correct.
allegations.
She did.
She did not.
She did.
She said she did not remember the event.
She said she never met Brett Kavanaugh.
No.
She did. I'm sorry. I know this upsets you, but it's true. She never met Brett Kavanaugh.
That she said she did not remember the event. That is her public position.
Right. She also said she never met Brett Kavanaugh, and you're neglecting that very important detail.
You're neglecting the fact that he said she denied the
Right,
event
she did. She
happened.
refuted it, and I just told you how she refuted it. She said she never met Brett Kavanaugh.
She said
And
she
facts
did,
don't care about your feelings. To quote a friend of mine from Los Angeles.
Her public position is that she does not remember the event happening. The absence of remembering an event is different than remembering the absence of an event. Kavanaugh said, and that's important. Kavanaugh is a judge; he would know that. That would be
Right.
pertinent.
She didn't. She didn't refute. Excuse me. She didn't refute what he said, or rather, she didn't refute the testimony there. Her refutation of the testimony is she said she never met Brett Kavanaugh. That's the refutation.
That's different than saying the event. She denied the event happened.
I know you're explaining one thing she said, and I'm pointing out another thing that she said, which refutes what Christine Ford said.
Right. Well, it's inaccurate to say that she
It is accurate.
denied
He spoke
the
exactly
accusation.
accurately. He also likes beer. He also still likes beer. I can't find a single lie that he said, and I still like beer too.
That's all I need.
Hey, I heard you mention a lot of things about socialism.
Yes.
So I'm for more of a mixed economy, and I am for Medicare for all. I believe.
Doesn't that seems awful? It seems like you want to become an old person. Why do you want to become an old person?
No,
Why do you want to
that's-
use old ideas like socialism?
No, that's giving everyone the right to health care, health insurance. And right now, our current system, we have 600,000 bankruptcies. People file for bankruptcy under our current system. Our current system is not cost effective. It cost,
I agree.
what was it, $33 trillion over a 10-year period from right now. And a recent study by the Mercatus Center actually found that the Medicare for All system in the Senate would save $2.1 trillion over a 10-year period from 2022 to 2031. So why can't you get behind that?
Well, when we were talking about the costs of these systems, one has to be very careful. I was promised certain costs for Obamacare, and there was a lot of fuzzy math because the taxes
to it
kicked in
than that.
early and the benefits didn't kick in quite so early. So the question is twofold. One, you're asking economically, you're saying that the current healthcare regime is not efficient, and therefore the socialist regime would be more efficient. That may actually be the case. That's not an argument for socialism, though. That's an argument for liberalization. That's for liberalizing the markets, making prices much more apparent to both the consumers and the service providers, to opening up what are now virtual monopolies for health insurance companies. And fortunately, by the way, this administration, it has around the edges worked on all of those things. There is also a moral argument as well, which is that people ought to be free, man ought to be free, and if healthcare is going to have to be rationed, I would rather it be rationed by me and my freedom of choice than by some bureaucratic board somewhere in the federal government. We see, to take forgetting all of the other problems of socialist healthcare, let's look at the example of little Charlie Gard in the United Kingdom, where
That's anecdotal.
it's that anecdote has happened several times over the last few years, but it illustrates my point,
Tens
which is
of thousands of people die every year in the U.S. because they lack health insurance.
Sure. I think many people around the world have died and been waiting on lines in socialist and communist regimes. So I don't think it's good to compare those numbers. The point that I will make, however, is that in countries, even mixed economies, even countries with relatively free socialist healthcare regimes, the government has the final say on what you can do, how you can treat yourself, how you can treat your children. When the Pope, when the head of the Catholic Church says, I will invite this baby into my country to receive health care, and the government has the right to say, absolutely not, we control your child. That's horrifically immoral, and we cannot allow that to happen here. Because, by the way, I'll also point out, when we speak about the efficiency of socialist healthcare regimes around the world, all of those regimes rely on the innovativeness of the American healthcare system, which leads the world and always has. It's true. You're shaking your head, but it's true. And so if the United States stops leading the way in healthcare, you're going to see that affect global markets and global healthcare regimes all around the world, and it'll be a very bad thing. And that is the reason that people, when they actually want care, living in Cuba, living in Canada, living in the United States, when even their private insurance that they're forced to buy doesn't cover, that's why they come to the United States, because we're the leaders.
We already ration care by the size of our wallets.
We ought to ration care by the size of our
We
wallets?
already ration our care by
Of
the
course
size of
we
our
don't. We have a
wallets.
robust social safety net. We have Medicare and Medicaid. We have a very generous social safety net, and nobody dies. I mean, it's one of the most absurd lies of people pushing socialist healthcare that people are dying in the streets. That's absurd. Anybody can walk into an emergency room. Nobody is dying in the streets in the United States and hasn't in the modern era.
Tens of thousands of people are dying in the U.S.
You
because
can
they don't
keep
have health
repeating your
insurance.
lie,
I'm just
but
saying.
it doesn't make it true. Show
You
me
can
the
do your
person who was
anecdote- you can do your
denied
anecdotal
entrance to an
stuff.
emergency room, my friend. Show me the person. I haven't seen them.
Hey, I'm for facts over feelings.
You can repeat good slogans as well as bad slogans, but they remain slogans nonetheless. And I'm explaining to you
I thought
the
your
way the
boss came
healthcare
up with
regime
that.
actually works.
Okay.
All right, hello. Thank
Hello.
you for coming out to Huntsville.
My pleasure.
First of all, because I think personally we're a campus that we're of the silent majority type, right? We're not we're apathetic politically, but We like to make our presence known.
That's because here you all study engineering and science because you actually want to contribute something to our
It's the
economy.
degrees that make money.
I never go to those places.
Just as a brief anecdote on that previous comment, my mother is actually a Canadian immigrant, and we kind of mess with her sometimes about the Canadian health system, and she realizes that it's not as good as here, because there you have to wait 2 years to get surgery.
Of course,
Even if you're dying.
I went down to that healthcare workers' paradise of Cuba last year when it was briefly opened up, and I went down there and I was talking to a Cuban citizen, and this Cuban citizen pointed out the famous Havana Hospital. You know, Michael Moore is always talking about how great it is. All the Hollywood lefties love it. And he said, that's the famous Havana Hospital. And I said, oh, is that so? And anybody can go in there, right, because of that universal medical insurance. And he said, oh, yes, anybody can go in there. There won't be any medicine when you go in there, but you can go right in. You've got to bring your own pillows, probably toilet paper, syringes, but you won't be able to get any medical service. For that, you need to go to the black market. That's the harsh reality that our friends are not willing to accept.
It's very true. So for my actual question, this is kind of just a generic question since the midterms are coming up pretty quickly. I asked this on behalf of conservatives in Democratic majority regions. What is your advice for conservatives in blue regions, as the midterms are basically a week out, to best get out the valid messages of conservatism and, valued principles, right?
You've got to remember that we actually can win. I have to remember this because I live in California. We have been constantly told for decades upon decades that, oh, conservatives aren't going to win. Oh, the New York Times said this almost exactly 2 years ago today. Hillary Clinton has a 92% chance of winning the election. Oh, Princeton University had a paper that came out. They said Hillary has a 99% chance. Stay home, conservatives. You could never, that's not good. Wait, hold on. How's Wisconsin going? Oh, in Pennsylvania, oh, no. So you've got to remember that we actually can win. It wasn't so long ago that even, forget purple states, even blue states like California were run by Ronald Reagan, for instance. It wasn't so long, and we do have a political realignment now, and we have a cracking of the lies, an exposure of the lies of the political news media, which are just the bullhorn for Democrats. They are the spokesmen and PR firms for Democrats at the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. So we've got to remember that isn't accurate. And when we go out there, even if we don't win this time, we might win next time, but go out, make that show of force. There are a lot of other people like it. If you watch the news right now as a foreigner, you would think that 175% of this country opposes Donald Trump, and yet you look at his approval ratings, he's at 50%, record highs, and he's even beating how Barack Obama was tracking at this time in his presidency. I'm hoping, I don't want to jinx it, knock on wood, that a lot of people, and specifically a lot of pollsters and CNN commentators, are going to be very surprised by these midterm elections. I think they're already surprised by the polls, and we should go out there and make sure that we surprise them all for the midterms. Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for coming here, but I wanted to make a quick comment. When you said that you can go into a hospital and they won't deny you, so what will usually happen is when a hospital, when you have no insurance, they will go in and they will stabilize you. You see this in a lot of cancer patients. They really don't treat the issue, and then you go back on the street, and usually you get to an ER and you continue to cycle until you die. Another thing you commented about was innovation.
Before we move on to that second point, I should like to point out that we have a robust social safety net for the elderly and the poor. And so one question would be why those people, if they can't afford insurance and they haven't been able to rectify their employment situation or whatever else is keeping it from them, aren't on the very robust and generous Medicaid systems in this country. As I will point out, I have a lot of friends who are actors. They refer to welfare programs as the federal arts subsidy. I'm not joking about that. And a lot of them are able to use these welfare programs. A lot of us would consider that abuse. I don't begrudge it to them. I just point it out to show how generous and how accessible our healthcare subsidies and safety net programs are.
So with that said, Mitch McConnell's already come out and said after the midterms that the Republicans are going to start looking to cut Social Security.
He said he's going to cut them or he's going to reform them?
Probably cut. He's got to make
probably,
some cut. What reform
probably
in
is.
any political talk is cut.
If ifs and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. Certainly, we have to reform the entitlement programs because they're unsustainable and they are the driver of our debt and deficits. They'll bankrupt the entire country. We already have a very high debt to GDP ratio. This isn't going to be solved by taking a $100 tax refund out of middle class pockets. This is going to be solved by reforming these massive programs that have grown wildly out of control. And that's what adults are going to have to do if we're governed by adults. And that's the difference that is being shown to us in these elections, is there is one group of people who are saying that we're going to give everything away from free. And you say, well, Miss Ocasio-Cortez, where are you going to get that $40 trillion? And she says, well, you know, I'm not the expert on these things. You don't say, truer words have never been spoken. And then you have another group that says, look, things cost money and we're going to have to deal seriously with these programs. I think that the American people are smart, and I think that they're going to reward behaving like adults, especially as we have this childish idiocy at restaurants, at people's homes, in the streets. That's not how adults behave, and I think that fortunately we're headed toward a more adult politics.
So if you reform or cut those programs, you have more people who are uninsured. I just want to make that statement.
Excuse me,
So
repeat
unless
that?
you're fixing the issue of health care and you're just reforming these and cutting them off, people have paid into Social Security and Medicare, and one of the solutions is to raise the cap. So if you reform these and start putting people off, you just create a public, worse public health crisis.
When have we said that we're going to kick people off of Medicaid or Medicare? Show me that proposal
You can
from
just
the
prevent people
conservatives.
from getting it when they're 65. So now you have an elderly population that doesn't have any health insurance. Do you just say, hey, you have to work at McDonald's or work at Walmart?
To which proposal are you referring that will take Medicare away from 65-year-olds?
I'm not saying you will. You'll just say you'll stop preventing people.
You
who
are.
65.
You're predicting
so
it,
you'll
my
say
friend.
the cutoff
I'm
limit
telling
to
you it's
people
not
who
going to
have
happen.
Medicare right
What
now at
hap-
this
what
moment,
happens if
you're
Santa
good.
Claus and the
people
Easter
who
Bunny
are 64
both
and about
descend
to turn
before our-
65, sorry, no Medicaid. So what do we do?
Well, I certainly won't elect you because you're going to take away my grandma's Medicare. So I'm not going to
Honestly,
elect you. I don't like your
expand
proposal
every
one
Medicaid
little
and Medicare
bit.
to everyone.
I'm sorry. What's your proposal?
I would love to expand it to everyone.
All right, and where are you going to get that $40 trillion?
You know what? For starters, I'd probably raise the income tax in the 1950s, since the Republicans love to say, "Oh, the golden age was."
What
in the
income tax
1950s.
rate do you propose?
I would
Because
say
you'd have to
probably
double. You'd have to
41%.
double tax receipts annually to the government. So where are you going to get that money from?
From probably income tax and such.
All
I
right,
could
all right.
raise,
You show me
wait.
when you make those numbers work. I'm a little skeptical that they're going to work, mostly because they don't work.
So I was letting people cut in front of me, but I got tired of all the people that disagree with you. So
I'm with you.
If
I
you
know.
don't mind.
I know. I like them. They were very nice, but I'm pleased to see. It's always good to see a friendly
Okay.
face. This is my safe space right now. I'm
Okay,
in
well,
my
I
safe
was actually
space.
going to ask you about that because I have a question about Catholicism, and I don't want to mess up your safe space. Is that okay?
Well, you know, some of the Catholic bishops have been messing with my safe space for all of the corruption over the last year, but I'm happy to give it a shot.
That's actually my question. So, my understanding of Catholicism may be off, but one of my understandings of it is that a lot of the non-biblical beliefs are based on a leadership's decision that this should be part of our prayers or our what we believe about the saints, those types of things. So how does that change, or does it, as a Catholic, to see what's going on with the Pope right now and the bishops, that there is definitely some issues, if not actual corruption in the hierarchy and the leadership?
There is a lot of corruption. It's certainly issues, but there's a lot of corruption too. That doesn't shake my faith at all. I mean, you know, the good Lord sends us fallible popes to remind us that popes are fallible except when they're infallible. So that's a good reminder now and again. As for the point you bring up, this is a point and a question that I've gotten a lot, which alludes to the supposedly unbiblical teachings of the Catholic Church. I would just encourage you to look into all of those. Fortunately, the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, so they've come up with an answer to everything, including, you know, Dear Catholic Answers, what should I have for breakfast on Tuesday morning? They'll say, oh, you should have grits and eggs and a little bit of bacon because of this passage of the letter to the Romans or whatever. But I don't find any unbiblical teachings. You know, the Bible was put together at a church council, and so those teachings do come, it seems to me, from the Bible. And if you if you want to ask about, one, for instance, I'm happy to answer it. But if I were to answer all of them, we'd be here for another 2,000 years. We'd have a 30 years war. I don't know. We might break up the European continent again. I'm happy to take one question.
Yeah, I'm not arguing. I'm just clarifying. So, and I don't mean that it's unbiblical. I just mean that it's not necessarily
extra-biblical.
Yes, there's a great word, extra-biblical. So you say, the popes are fallible or they're infallible. Can you tell me, as a Catholic, what you think the difference is and how you can tell?
Well, the Pope, as papal infallibility was defined, this is an often misunderstood concept. The Pope may only infallibly defend the doctrine of the faith for 2,000 years. And so if the Pope came out tomorrow and said, I don't know, something crazy, as maybe we have seen over the last year or two, then that would not be infallible teaching. It's in many ways a way to rein in the power of popes, just as much as it is taken to be a way to expand the power of popes and other bishops. When you to the question on corruption, it's very disheartening, particularly with this pope, because when this pope came in, he said that we're going to have transparency, we're going to have an end to clericalism, this is a new day. And what happened? The minute that a high-ranking Vatican official retired with nothing to gain, made allegations that this pope covered up abuse against priests and seminarians, he said, well, now we need to be silent. Now is the time for silence. That's my impression. He all but said, shut up, don't do it. This has happened also with young Catholics, whom he has suggested are too traditional or too rigid. He said, they're too rigid. They've got to loosen up a little bit. He said that the whole Mass should only be 40 minutes. The homily should be 8 minutes. It depends who's giving the homily. And I really wish that we could have some clarity and transparency that we were promised, because we've gotten exactly the opposite of it. No bishops have said their goodbyes, have retired, and I think that people who are Catholic, the Catholic laity, should vote with their wallets, and they should refuse to give one single penny to the bishop's appeals, to any, give money to keep the lights on in the church, but any of those bishop's appeals or bishop-affiliated organizations, they shouldn't give a single penny until the high-ranking officials in this church are held accountable for rife, horrific corruption and abuse. It's a good question.
Hello. I've started listening to Ben Shapiro's podcasts, and he doesn't always refer to you very complimentary.
No, well, you don't say. What does he, how does, because I haven't, it's been a while, how does he refer to me?
Using words I'm not going to repeat. So, my question is, I've never heard you retaliate. Is that, are you turning your cheek? Or is he your boss and you don't want to say anything?
This is clear spiritual humility and a little bit of professional savvy, since I don't want to be living in that cardboard box anymore. No, what it really is look, I mean, you might not know this because you're not a #1 best-selling author, but when you put your whole life into a work as magnificent and important as my political treatise, and then it sells so many more copies than all of the books that Ben has written, where for some reason he put words into all of them, you feel a certain responsibility, a certain dignity of that office, I mean, when Ben wises up and stops putting words in his books, then he'll have sold as many copies, and then it's a fair fight. But until then, I would never retaliate in that way. It just wouldn't be dignified. Very good question.
All right, guys, this will be our last question for tonight.
This better be a great question. This better
wow,
bring that house down.
Okay, here we go. All right, just please stand right there on that next. Thank you.
So in order to truly debate against a side, you must first learn the arguments that the other side prevents. This also means you must find the flaws in your own logic before you can argue against the other side. Given there is no perfect stance on any policy, what, in your opinion, is the biggest flaw in the conservative movement?
Well, I reject your premise that there's no perfect stance on any policy. I mean, I've certainly examined my own opinions, and I've changed my opinions often over time. One of the great advantages to living in left-wing areas is that you constantly have to defend your points of view, and you have to make sure that you whittle them down, and maybe you dump certain points of view, maybe you pick up others, maybe you're persuaded to a new one. But just on the question of life, on the question of abortion, because it's been in the news so much lately with the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, there is a perfect point of view on that, which is to defend life and to oppose snuffing out that life in the womb. That is a perfect stance on that policy. That is a perfect stance. Now, does that mean that the conservative movement has figured out every perfect stance on every policy? Absolutely not. And I'll go even further. It had figured out certain perfect stances on certain policies, on certain questions of immigration, for instance, or of free trade, that no longer apply because of the changing circumstances. Politics is not philosophy. Politics takes place in time and space, in changing circumstances. And one of the flaws of the conservative movement, if I had to give one flaw, is that sometimes it gets stuck in the glories of the past. You think back to Saint Gipper, dear Ronald Reagan, one of the greatest men in American history, and you think, let's just do that, let's just do that. But we can't just do that, because we're not living in the 1980s anymore, and we could have morning in America again, but it's going to be a new morning on a new day in America, and I think we're finally beginning to wake up and re-examine some old dogmas, and that's a beautiful thing. Antonin Scalia said his biggest criticism of the Constitution was it wasn't so easy to add amendments, to make amendments to the Constitution. I think we're beginning to feel a little bit of that freedom and that exuberance to make some amendments to long-held conservative orthodoxy, and I think it's a beautiful thing. Great question. All right, guys, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again. Thank you.